At times, I believe I might possess the unofficial global distinction for the most absurd homeowners association dispute resulting in a felony conviction. I invite you to share if you've encountered a more outlandish tale than the one I am about to recount. The entire affair commenced, as such matters frequently do, with an immense abuse of authority embodied by one Agnes Periwinkle, our HOA President, or, by her preferred title, the Steward of Community Standards. In my own mind, I simply referred to her as Karen, though never directly to her, at least not until the final confrontation. This specific ordeal concluded with her hysterically insisting on a special forces unit and an airlift because her self-proclaimed HOA master key failed to provide her entry into my personal dwelling. This all occurred while my own son, may his forbearance be praised, served as the 911 dispatcher fielding her call, initially attempting to handle the situation with what amounted to professional skepticism. She was oblivious to the fact that her tantrum was not only being documented but was also being skillfully handled by an individual who precisely understood the volatile nature she represented. And believe me, the consequences were about to become exceedingly tangible for Agnes. It all commenced, as these suburban nightmares frequently do, quite harmlessly. Our former HOA president, a genial elderly man named Mr. Henderson, who primarily occupied himself with the annual petunia contest and making sure the Christmas illuminations weren't overly flamboyant, opted to retire and relocate nearer to his grandchildren. His exit created a leadership void, and into this void emerged Agnes Periwinkle, a woman whose main credential appeared to be an unending reserve of self-righteous anger and a conviction that the neighborhood rules were sacred documents authored by archangels. To state it mildly, she was quite a character. Early on, I recall her campaign, if one could term it as such. It largely involved going from house to house, not to request votes, but to identify trivial violations. "Your azaleas are encroaching 1 inch onto the common path, Mr. Smith," she would declare, her voice saturated with the sort of disdain typically reserved for persistent offenders in a high-security penitentiary. She drove an immaculate pearl-white Lexus SUV, the type that invariably looked freshly valeted, and her attire was an exhibition of costly yet somehow cheerless propriety, rigidly starched blouses, sharply pressed trousers, and practical heels that nonetheless tapped with disconcerting authority on the walkway. Her hair was a helmet of impeccably styled silver, impervious to wind or logic. I am an engineer by profession, semi-retired at present, but I dedicated 40 years to designing and deploying secure access systems for numerous facilities, some of which were highly sensitive. My thinking naturally leans towards logic, regulations, and the unambiguous definition of rights and duties. So, when Agnes was elected, a description I used loosely, as the voter participation was dreadful and most of us merely wanted someone, anyone, to take the position so we could resume our lives, I reasoned, all right, a bit of a busybody. But we'll cope. I had managed far more difficult personalities in corporate settings. How mistaken I was. Her initial months were a whirlwind of new regulations, amendments to existing bylaws, and progressively stricter interpretations of established guidelines. The community newsletter, once a jovial compilation of birthdays and bake sales, transformed into a somber enumeration of infractions and admonitions. Lawn gnomes were decreed aesthetically disruptive. Wind chimes constituted noise pollution. The approved range of colors for exterior paint was reduced to 3 equally unexciting shades of beige. My neighbor, elderly Mrs. Gable, who had resided in her home for 50 years and whose award-winning roses were the pride of the street, received a formal reprimand because some petals had purportedly fallen onto the sidewalk in an untidy manner. It was insanity, but a subtle, creeping form of insanity that most residents merely grumbled about and adhered to in order to avoid conflict. The master key policy was introduced approximately 6 months into her tyrannical tenure. It was presented during a sparsely attended Tuesday evening HOA meeting, concealed within the new business segment of the agenda. Agnes stood at the unsteady podium in our community clubhouse, beaming as if she had just solved global famine. "For the safety and security of our community," she proclaimed, her voice echoing with self-importance, "and to permit emergency access and routine maintenance inspections as deemed necessary by the board, the HOA will be acquiring a master key system for all residences." A stunned silence descended upon the room. Even her customary supporters on the board appeared slightly uncomfortable. Someone, I believe it was Tom Henderson, a soft-spoken accountant from further down the road, eventually spoke up. "Agnes, are you referring to a key that can unlock all our front doors?" She smiled condescendingly. "Precisely, Mr. Henderson. for efficiency and adherence to community standards. Naturally, its use will be rigorously controlled. Cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't merely overstepping. This was a blatant contempt for privacy, security, and fundamental property rights. I designed systems to prevent unauthorized access, not to enable it at the whim of a self-appointed overseer. I raised my hand. Miss Periwinkle, I started, maintaining as neutral a tone as possible. Could you please identify the specific article in our covenants or any pertinent state or local laws that empower the HOA to hold a master key to private residences? She blinked, her smile faltering for a microsecond. It's an initiative for community betterment, Mr. Davies. A proactive measure. With all due respect, I persisted. Proactive measures still need to be lawful. Compelling homeowners to grant access to their homes in this way without individual consent or a clearly, legally defined emergency seems exceedingly problematic. What locksmith would even consent to fashion such a system for an HOA without individual homeowner permissions? I possessed some knowledge of locksmithing ethics and regulations. What she was suggesting was a legal minefield. Her face tensed. The pearl-white Lexus of her composure was revealing an imperfection. The board has sanctioned this, she retorted, gesturing vaguely towards the two other board members, who were now intently examining their footwear. It's for the collective good. The discussion, if it could be termed as such, deteriorated from that point. I calmly highlighted the legal consequences, the security hazards. What if that key were lost or stolen? And the sheer impudence of the proposal. She, in response, accused me of being uncooperative, disruptive, and not a team player. The motion, naturally, was approved, though I suspected the votes were cast more to evade her displeasure than out of genuine concurrence. I returned home that evening incensed, but also with a chilling sense of resolve. This was no longer about lawn gnomes. This was a boundary. I promptly began researching Virginia state law concerning landlord-tenant rights. Even though we were homeowners, the access principles were analogous, trespass laws, and HOA authorities. Unsurprisingly, there was absolutely nothing to substantiate her master key initiative. In fact, most legal precedents strongly favored protecting the inviolability of a private home. I composed a courteous yet firm letter to the HOA board, citing the applicable statutes and legal opinions, and formally declared that I would not adhere to any demand to furnish a key to my residence, nor would I allow any unauthorized modification to my locks to suit such a system. I dispatched it via certified mail, with a return receipt requested. I also commenced enhancing my home security. New deadbolts, the type that couldn't be easily master-keyed by any conventional method she might attempt to coerce a local locksmith into, and a pair of inconspicuous, high-resolution security cameras covering my front porch and entrance. I sensed that matters were about to intensify, and if there's one thing my career instilled in me, it's the importance of thorough documentation and undeniable proof. My son, Mark, who was already employed as a 911 dispatcher, initially thought I was being slightly paranoid, but he was aware of my professional history. "Just be cautious, Dad," he had advised. "Individuals like that can be erratic when their authority is contested." He had no inkling of how accurate he was, or how directly he would eventually become embroiled. The HOA's reply to my letter was a brusque, dismissive note asserting that the Master Key program was advancing as intended for the welfare of all residents. Agnes Periwinkle, it appeared, was unaccustomed to being contradicted, and I, it seemed, was on the verge of becoming her principal adversary. The scene was arranged for a confrontation, and I was systematically getting ready for it, not comprehending that it would unfold in a manner neither of us could have ever foreseen. The weeks subsequent to my formal refusal to engage in Agnes Periwinkle's Master Key initiative were marked by a consistent increase in trivial harassments. It was as though, by contesting her authority on that single crucial issue, I had affixed a giant bullseye to my back for every imaginable minor transgression, whether real or fabricated. My meticulously maintained lawn, previously a source of quiet satisfaction, abruptly transformed into a field of conflict. One week, I was issued a violation notice because my grass was purportedly a quarter of an inch too tall. According to some freshly devised HOA regulation she must have personally calibrated. The following week, A different notice asserted my edging lacked sufficient crispness, accompanied by a hazy photograph that seemed to have been captured during a seismic event. I replied to each with composed, factual letters, complete with dated photographs, and, in the instance of the grass height, a notarized affidavit from my lawn care provider confirming adherence. It was wearisome, like fending off a swarm of relentless, buzzing insects, but I understood that yielding on minor matters would only embolden her. Agnes, in her pearl-white Lexus, would frequently drive slowly past my residence, her gaze lingering a bit excessively, her expression a blend of disapproval and something I could only characterize as predatory expectation. It was evident she was anticipating my making a mistake, providing her with a pretext for more significant action. The other neighbors were a diverse group. Some, like old Mrs. Gable, were quietly supportive, offering hushed words of encouragement when they believed Agnes wasn't observing. Mrs. Gable had even begun leaving small, anonymous tokens of solidarity in my mailbox. A pressed flower, a newspaper article about a particularly flagrant HOA overreach in another state. Others, intimidated by Agnes's forceful enforcement, maintained their distance, fearful of becoming her subsequent target. The HOA board, excluding Agnes, comprised 2 other members. A jittery man named Arthur Jenkins, who seemed perpetually frightened of his own reflection, and a woman named Brenda Riley, who appeared to be Agnes's main sycophant, nodding enthusiastically at everything Agnes uttered and repeating her views with a fervor that bordered on unsettling. They were typical enablers, either too feeble or too self-serving to contest Agnes's increasingly dictatorial conduct. I attempted to reason with Arthur once, intercepting him as he was collecting his mail. "Arthur," I said gently, "this master key notion, it's not merely a poor idea, it's legally indefensible. You're exposing the HOA and yourselves as board members to considerable liability." He paled, mumbled something about Agnes having done her research, and practically bolted back into his house. It was apparent that logic and reason were not going to breach the barrier of fear and delusion Agnes had erected around her petty domain. My son Mark would telephone me every few days to check on my well-being. "How's the HOA conflict progressing, Dad?" he'd inquire, a hint of amusement in his voice that was slowly being superseded by apprehension. I'd update him on the latest absurdity, and he'd just let out a sigh. "She sounds like a genuine piece of work. Are you certain you don't want to just relocate to a condominium downtown?" I chuckle and concede defeat. "Never. Besides, I enjoy my house, my garden, and frankly, Mark, it's the principle of the matter. This isn't her personal dominion." I persisted in meticulously documenting everything. Every notice, every letter, every slow drive-by from Agnes. My security cameras, initially set up with the master key issue in mind, were now recording a plethora of footage depicting Agnes's odd behaviors, including one notable instance where she was captured on video trying to measure the height of my mailbox with a tape measure, her face contorted in focus. It would have been amusing if it weren't so disquieting. I also made it a point to scrutinize our HOA covenants and bylaws with extreme care, cross-referencing them with state and local statutes. I aimed to be absolutely positive about my rights and her constraints. Knowledge, as the saying goes, is power, and I was equipping myself with as much of it as feasible. The Master Key Project, notwithstanding my protests and, I suspected, the silent apprehension of many other residents, appeared to be gradually advancing. Whispers circulated that Agnes had located a locksmith from out of town, someone less principled or perhaps simply unaware of the full ramifications, who was prepared to carry out the work. She commenced dispatching notices scheduling voluntary lock inspection and upgrade appointments. The term voluntary was clearly an inaccurate description, as the notices were succeeded by increasingly menacing letters implying severe repercussions for non-adherence, including fines and even suggestions of legal action, though on what basis, she never clarified. I, naturally, disregarded these notices, having already made my stance unequivocally clear. This only seemed to enrage Agnes further. The pettiness intensified. One morning, I discovered a small, almost imperceptible scratch on my car door. The subsequent day, my newspaper was absent. A coincidence, possibly? But within the context of Agnes's escalating campaign, it felt like a deliberate, immature provocation. I reported the scratch to the police, more for the purpose of documentation than any anticipation that they would identify the perpetrator, and installed an additional camera with a view of my driveway. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was tense. You could sense it in the curt nods instead of amicable waves, the rushed exchanges that ceased abruptly when Agnes's Lexus came into view. It was a textbook example of a bully holding an entire community captive through intimidation and the misuse of a minor authoritative position. I was aware that a confrontation was unavoidable. I simply didn't know when or how it would occur. I ensured my legal documents were organized, my evidence meticulously sorted, and my determination unwavering. I even had a discreet conversation with a lawyer acquaintance who specialized in property disagreements. He examined my documentation and Agnes's master key proposal and simply let out a whistle. "She's so far beyond her authority, it's not even amusing," he stated. "If she attempts to compel entry or take action against you for refusing, you'll have her completely cornered. Keep those cameras active." That was the strategy. I felt as though I were residing in a slow-motion siege, anticipating the certain assault. And then, one bright Tuesday morning, it transpired. I was in my home office, engaged in designing for a small consultancy project I had undertaken, when I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a key fumbling in my front door lock. My heart rate accelerated. The moment it appeared had come. I walked silently to my front window, looking through a gap in the blinds, and there she was, Agnes Periwinkle, resplendent in a canary yellow pantsuit that did nothing for her silver helmet of hair glinting in the sunlight. In her hand, she clutched a single, shiny key attached to an oversized plastic tag labeled HOA Master, Sector 1. She was jiggling it in my deadbolt, a look of intense concentration blended with smug self-importance on her face. My deadbolt, naturally, was a high-security, non-standard model I had installed specifically to thwart this type of foolishness. Her master key, whatever its source, was never going to unlock it. I could observe the frustration accumulating on her face as the key declined to turn. She attempted it upside down. She jiggled it with greater force. She even gave the door a slight push as if that would magically cause the tumblers to align. My security camera, strategically mounted above the door, was capturing every instant in stunning high definition. I almost experienced a pang of pity for her almost. But then I recalled the months of harassment, the anxiety she had inflicted upon Mrs. Gable, the overall climate of oppression she had fostered. No, any pity vanished swiftly, supplanted by a cold, almost detached curiosity about how this situation would unfold. After another minute of futile attempts, she retreated, huffing, and retrieved her phone. I observed her dial, her lips moving angrily. I had a very, very strong suspicion whom she was contacting. My son, Mark, was on duty at the county's 911 dispatch center that morning. This was poised to become intriguing. I couldn't discern her side of the dialogue, of course, but I could envision it. Her voice, typically so authoritative when addressing us ordinary residents, would likely be a carefully controlled mix of authority and feigned alarm when conversing with emergency services. I imagined Mark recognizing the address, perhaps even her voice if she was a frequent caller for trivial complaints, striving to keep his professional composure. A few minutes elapsed. Agnes was now pacing on my porch, phone clamped to her ear, gesticulating emphatically. Then I noticed her demeanor alter. She glanced up at my house, then back at her phone. A flicker of something bewilderment, irritation crossed her face. This, I surmised, was Mark implementing his initial tactic, professional obstruction. He would be posing clarifying questions, confirming details, perhaps placing her on hold to confer with a supervisor or verify officer availability in her area. Anything to impede her progress and subtly underscore the absurdity of phoning 911 because her non-existent authority wasn't being acknowledged by my door lock. I could almost hear him. "Ma'am, could you spell the name Periwinkle for me again? And you're stating your key, an HOA master key, isn't functioning on a private residence? Is the resident at home? Are they in peril? Are you in peril?" Each question, perfectly sensible from a dispatcher's viewpoint, would be like a tiny needle prick to Agnes's inflated sense of self. Her pacing intensified. She was speaking quickly now, her gestures becoming more uncontrolled. I saw her indicate my door, then jab a finger towards the sky, then clutch her chest in a theatrical manner. This was the escalation stage. Whatever Mark was communicating or not communicating was clearly not providing her with the immediate validation she anticipated. She wasn't receiving the prompt dispatch of a SWAT team to enforce her wishes. Then, through my closed window, I began to catch fragments of her side of the exchange, her voice ascending in pitch and volume. Absolutely outrageous, uncooperative, and possibly dangerous individual. I am the HOA President. I demand access. He could be doing anything in there. This is a serious security risk. Her voice was cracking with fury. I had to commend Mark's self-control if he was managing to maintain a serious expression through this. He knew me. He knew I was likely in my slippers, enjoying coffee and contemplating whether to prune the roses later. The notion of me being a dangerous individual was, frankly, comical. But Agnes was not amused. She was working herself into a complete Karen-style meltdown. And then came the decisive moment. I heard her practically scream into the phone, "No, you don't comprehend. This man, Davies, he's deranged. I fear for my safety. I fear for the community. He's barricaded himself in. I think I might require an airlift." Yes, an airlift and special forces. He's truly dangerous, I assure you. He could possess weapons. You must dispatch everyone immediately. My jaw, which had been set in grim amusement, nearly struck the floor. An airlift? Special forces? She had transitioned from a thwarted meddler to portraying me as the antagonist in a Tom Clancy novel. This was no longer merely a case of HOA overreach. This was a malicious, fantastical allegation being made to emergency services. I saw her conclude the call, a look of grim satisfaction on her face, as if she had single-handedly prevented a national disaster. She smoothed her canary yellow pantsuit, puffed out her chest, and stood there expectantly, like a Roman emperor awaiting a triumphant legion. Little did she realize, the legion she had invoked, founded on her own hysterical falsehoods, was indeed en route, and it was going to be far more than she anticipated, in ways she couldn't possibly fathom. The initial phase of subtle provocation from Mark's end was clearly concluded. Agnes had, in her boundless conceit, just issued a demand her credibility could not meet. And the dispatcher on the other end, my son, was now professionally compelled to react to the seriousness of her assertions, however preposterous they appeared to anyone who actually knew me. The distant drone of a helicopter was just starting to become audible in the tranquil morning atmosphere. The subtle whirring in the distance grew steadily more pronounced, resolving into the unmistakable thwack 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 of a helicopter. Agnes Periwinkle, still positioned like a sentry on my porch, actually cracked a smug little smile, her lips curving. She likely envisioned it as the lead element of her special forces, arriving to free the neighborhood from the dangerous, barricaded Mr. Davies. I, conversely, experienced a peculiar blend of incredulity and grim contentment. She had truly done it. She had escalated her petty despotism to the extent of summoning a full-blown emergency response based on utter fabrication. Through the window, I observed the first police car turn onto our street, lights flashing but sirens silent. A cautious approach for a potentially hazardous scenario. Then another and another. Within minutes, our tranquil suburban cul-de-sac resembled a scene from an action film. 2 fire engines rumbled to a stop, their masts seeming to occupy the entire street. An ambulance, its crew appearing perplexed, positioned itself a little further down. Overhead, the news helicopter, no, wait, that was a police chopper, circled, its downdraft agitating the leaves on the trees and, much to my amusement, severely disheveling Agnes's helmet of hair. For the first time, a flicker of something beyond triumph crossed her features, perhaps a minute seed of doubt that this might be slightly over the top. I determined it was time for me to emerge. I calmly proceeded to my front door, unlocked the perfectly operational, "Thank you very much," deadbolt, and opened it. Agnes, who was in the midst of dramatically gesturing towards my house for the benefit of a rather stern-faced police sergeant approaching her, actually recoiled as if I had materialized from nowhere. "There he is, officer. That's the man. He's dangerous," she shrieked, her voice now tinged with genuine alarm as the sheer magnitude of the response she had triggered began to register with her. The sergeant, a tall, weary-looking man with Sergeant Miller on his name tag, gave me a long, evaluative glance, then shifted his gaze back to Agnes, then to the assembled emergency vehicles, then back to me. I could almost perceive the gears turning in his mind. Highly agitated woman in a yellow pantsuit alleging imminent peril versus a calm, older gentleman in a cardigan opening his own front door. I simply stood there, hands visible, a neutral expression on my face. "Good morning, Sergeant," I stated, my voice steady. "Quite a disturbance. Is there something I can assist you with?" Sergeant Miller raised a hand to quiet Agnes, who was still spluttering about barricades and hostile intentions. "Sir," he addressed me, "we received a 911 call reporting a potential hostage situation, a barricaded subject, possibly armed and dangerous, and a request for an airlift and special assistance. The caller, this lady here," he indicated Agnes, "identified herself as the HOA President and asserted you were denying her lawful entry and constituted a significant threat." I nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, Miss Periwinkle, our HOA President. She was attempting to access my private residence using a so-called HOA master key which, as far as I am aware, possesses no legal authority. When her key, predictably, failed to operate on my high-security lock, she appears to have become somewhat agitated." I maintained a matter-of-fact tone, deliberately eschewing any trace of sarcasm, though it was severely tempting. Agnes, meanwhile, was aghast. "It's not so-called. It's an official HOA key. He's lying. He's trying to deceive you." Sergeant Miller looked at her. "Ma'am, did you actually observe any weapons? Did he threaten you verbally or physically before you contacted 911? Agnes faltered. Her eyes darted from me to the sergeant. The falsehood was becoming more difficult to uphold face-to-face with genuine authority. "Well, no, not precisely, but he's very uncooperative and his refusal to permit an HOA inspection is profoundly suspicious. He could have anything in there. He locked himself in." "He's in his own home, ma'am," Sergeant Miller stated, his voice acquiring a distinct note of impatience. "People are generally permitted to be in their own homes, locked or otherwise." He turned back to me. "Sir, do you have any objections to us just taking a brief look around to confirm there's no immediate emergency, merely to fulfill procedural requirements given the nature of the call?" "Not at all, Sergeant," I responded. "Please come in. You'll find I was simply in my office working. My son, Mark Davies, is actually one of your dispatchers. He might have even handled the call. Perhaps you're acquainted with him." At the mention of Mark's name, Sergeant Miller's eyebrow shot upwards. "Mark Davies? Yes, good kid. Sharp. So he took this call." He glanced at Agnes again, and this time his expression was one of dawning realization and profound exasperation. The pieces were falling into place for him. The dangerous, barricaded subject was the father of one of his own dispatchers. The hostage situation was a man drinking coffee in his study. The request for an airlift was appearing increasingly like a colossal squandering of taxpayer funds and emergency resources. While two officers conducted a swift, professional inspection of my house, confirming, to no one's astonishment but Agnes's apparent ongoing suspicion, that I was not, in fact, operating a clandestine militia training facility or holding mythical hostages, I calmly elucidated the situation to Sergeant Miller on my porch. I detailed the history of Agnes's Master Key initiative, my formal refusal based on legal principles, and her ensuing campaign of minor provocations. Crucially, I then stated, "Sergeant, if you'll just grant me one moment." I went back inside and came back with a tablet. "This is footage from my front door security camera, timestamped from about 30 minutes ago." I played the video showing Agnes fumbling with the key, growing progressively more irate, then making the dramatic 911 call. The audio was distinct enough to capture her increasingly wild assertions. Sergeant Miller watched, his expression hardening with each passing second. The other officers, their inspection finished and finding nothing unusual, gathered to observe over his shoulder. The fire crews and ambulance personnel, perceiving that the situation was not as it had been reported, were beginning to look noticeably irritated at being summoned for what was evidently a charade. When the video concluded, displaying Agnes triumphantly ending the call after demanding special forces, Sergeant Miller slowly turned to her. The atmosphere crackled. Even the helicopter seemed to quieten, as if holding its breath. "Miss Periwinkle," he commenced, his voice dangerously low and controlled, "making a false police report is a grave offense. Misusing emergency services, fabricating a narrative that occupies multiple units, including air support, fire, and EMS, carries substantial penalties. Based on what I've just observed and heard and the utter lack of any evidence to corroborate your claims of imminent danger, barricades, or weapons, I'm finding it very difficult to comprehend your actions this morning." Agnes had transitioned from pearl white to a sort of mottled gray. The canary yellow pantsuit suddenly appeared garish and ridiculous. But he wouldn't allow me entry. It's HOA policy. I am the president, she stammered, her audacity completely gone, supplanted by a dawning terror. Ma'am, Sergeant Miller declared, taking a step nearer, your HOA policies do not override state law, nor do they grant you the authority to invent emergencies. You knowingly provided false statements to a 911 dispatcher. My officer confirmed it was indeed your voice from a recording of the call, alleging a life-threatening situation that simply did not exist. This entire response, he gestured broadly at the assembled forces, is a direct consequence of your false claims. He then turned to one of his officers. Officer Jones, please read Agnes Periwinkle her Miranda rights. She's being placed under arrest for making a false report and misuse of emergency services. The satisfying click of handcuffs ratcheting shut was, I admit, delightful to my ears. Agnes Periwinkle, steward of community standards, was at last confronting genuine standards, the legal variety. And my son, the dispatcher, who had professionally and then dutifully managed her irrationality, had just initiated a sequence of events that would bring her reign to a dramatic and very public conclusion. The repercussions of Agnes Periwinkle's theatrical arrest on my front lawn were, to state it mildly, the primary topic of conversation in the neighborhood for weeks. As the police vehicle drove off with Agnes staring vacantly out the rear window, her canary yellow pantsuit now appearing decidedly disheveled and her silver hair askew, a collective exhalation of relief seemed to spread through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had previously been too cowed to even establish eye contact were abruptly emerging from their houses, blinking in the sunlight like startled meerkats, a combination of disbelief and dawning joy on their faces. Mrs. Gable, bless her, actually performed a little celebratory dance on her driveway. Sergeant Miller, after recording my detailed account and obtaining copies of my video proof and HOA communications, shook my hand. Mr. Davies, he remarked with a hint of a tired smile, your son, Mark, is a competent dispatcher. He handled the call according to procedure, particularly once the assertions became extreme. She truly engineered her own downfall here. We will be in contact concerning the charges. He also noted that the county would likely seek to recover the expenses of the unneeded deployment from Agnes Periwinkle, which, considering the helicopter, multiple police units, fire trucks, and ambulance, was destined to be a considerable sum. That in itself, I mused, would be a difficult consequence for her to accept, quite apart from the criminal accusations. The ensuing investigation was comprehensive. My video evidence of her attempting to employ the master key and her subsequent hysterical 911 call was, naturally, Exhibit A. However, what her arrest initiated was something more extensive. With Agnes temporarily incapacitated and her authority demolished, other residents started to share their own accounts of her overreach, harassment, and dubious decisions as HOA President. It transpired that her master key initiative was merely the visible portion of a larger problem. There were claims of financial improprieties in the HOA accounts, contracts given to associates without proper bidding, and a general habit of utilizing the HOA as her personal fund and power base. The police, initially concentrating on the false 911 call, soon found themselves managing a much broader investigation. My meticulous records, originally meant for self-protection, became a valuable asset for them in comprehending the timeline and extent of Agnes's wrongdoings. The two remaining board members, Arthur Jenkins and Brenda Riley, found themselves under examination as well. Arthur, predictably, cooperated entirely, furnishing investigators with whatever information he possessed, likely endeavoring to protect himself. Brenda, Agnes's devoted sycophant, initially attempted to obstruct, but confronted with the accumulating evidence and the possibility of potential complicity charges, she too began to divulge information. The list of charges against Agnes expanded. It commenced with making a false police report and misuse of emergency services. But as the financial inquiry intensified, charges of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty were appended. It appeared that Agnes had been systematically diverting funds from the HOA reserves for years, employing them for personal expenditures, extravagant excursions disguised as HOA research, and even remunerations to the out-of-town locksmith who had consented to her master key scheme. A locksmith who, it was revealed, was a distant relative with a rather questionable reputation. Her effort to gain entry to my house, it was conjectured, might have been motivated by a desperate urge to locate or suppress something, or perhaps merely an arrogant display of power that she sensed was diminishing as residents grew more dissatisfied. The master key, it became clear, wasn't solely about inspections. It was about dominance and potentially concealing her misdeeds. The sheer nerve of phoning 911 with such preposterous claims was perhaps an indication of her escalating desperation and detachment from reality. My son Mark was initially somewhat concerned about any professional repercussions for his management of the call, but his supervisors, after examining the recordings and Sergeant Miller's report, praised him. He had adhered to protocol scrupulously. He had initially endeavored to de-escalate and obtain clarification, and when Agnes's assertions reached a critical point of alleged peril, he had dispatched the suitable level of response based on her statements. The accountability for the enormous deployment and its subsequent expense rested squarely with Agnes. In fact, Mark's professionalism under pressure became a minor legend at the dispatch center. The fellow whose father was accused of requiring an airlift by the irrational HOA lady. He handled it with composure, though he did confess to me later, "Dad, when she started screaming about special forces, I knew she was finished. No one makes assertions like that without anticipating a serious reaction. I just had to ensure I performed my job correctly, so she couldn't evade the consequences." And he had. His calm adherence to procedure in the face of his own mother's bizarre fabrications was crucial in ensuring justice was administered. The legal proceedings against Agnes Periwinkle extended for months. She engaged a prominent lawyer who employed every tactic available. Assertions of emotional distress, contentions that she was acting in good faith for the community, even endeavors to undermine my credibility and that of other residents. But the evidence was conclusive. The video footage was undeniable. The financial records depicted a clear narrative of theft and deceit. And the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of her 911 call, played in court, left the jury members visibly taken aback, some even finding it difficult to suppress laughter at the airlift request before quickly composing their expressions. I was summoned to testify, as were several other residents, Sergeant Miller and even Mark, who calmly narrated the specifics of the 911 call from his professional standpoint as a dispatcher. Throughout the trial, Agnes projected an air of wronged innocence, her costly, though now less immaculate, attire a stark juxtaposition to the grim actuality of her circumstances. She still seemed to believe, right up until the verdict, that she was the aggrieved party, a devoted community servant unjustly persecuted for attempting to maintain standards. The jury, however, perceived matters differently. They found her guilty on multiple counts: felony making a false report to emergency services, elevated to a felony owing to the magnitude of the resources squandered and the nature of the false claims of immediate peril, and multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The sentencing was the final scene in this suburban melodrama. The judge, a no-nonsense woman renowned for her firm stance on white-collar crime and abuse of trust, was unsparing in her summation. She spoke of the profound betrayal of trust Agnes had perpetrated against her neighbors, the taxpayers whose funds she had wasted with her false alarm, and the emergency services personnel she had jeopardized by diverting them from potential genuine crises. She underscored the deliberate nature of the financial offenses and the arrogance inherent in the master key debacle and the subsequent 911 call. When the sentence was delivered, 5 years in state prison, plus substantial restitution to the HOA and the county for the emergency response costs, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. Agnes visibly slumped, all semblance of composure vanishing. Her lawyer appeared dejected. For me, it wasn't a moment of triumph or retribution, precisely. It was a moment of profound, weary relief. Justice, often protracted and unwieldy, had finally been rendered. The 5-year sentence was a consequence of the entirety of her conduct. The felony false reporting was grave enough, but coupled with years of systematic embezzlement and fraud, it depicted a serial abuser of power and trust. The 911 call was merely the event that caused her entire edifice of deceit to collapse. Ultimately, Agnes Periwinkle's tyrannical reign concluded not with a whimper, but with the resounding clang of a prison door. The neighborhood experienced a kind of revival. A new HOA board was elected, comprising sensible, community-focused individuals, including, to my astonishment, Mrs. Gable, who discovered a renewed sense of purpose. The ludicrous regulations were overturned. The finances were restored to order. The climate of fear and suspicion was supplanted by one of collaboration and neighborliness. People began planting colorful flowers once more. Wind chimes tinkled joyfully, and lawn gnomes, in a defiant homage to kitsch, made a triumphant reappearance. My life reverted to its tranquil, semi-retired pace, though I did acquire a certain renown as the man who brought down the HOA Karen. Mark continued his career as a dispatcher, receiving a promotion not long thereafter, his reputation for calm proficiency further cemented. We occasionally jest about the airlift incident, but beneath the humor lies a serious lesson regarding the misuse of power, however minor its initial extent, and the significance of advocating for one's rights methodically and with undeniable proof. Agnes Periwinkle desired a master key to our dwellings. Instead, her own conduct furnished the key that precipitated her downfall, resulting in her conviction and a 5-year lesson in humility. And it all commenced because she simply could not grasp that some doors, and some individuals, will not be forced open by intimidation. So, what are your thoughts? The most outlandish HOA narrative ever? I'm genuinely interested to learn if anyone can surpass the tale of Airlift Karen. And if you've reached this point, thank you for listening to my account of suburban conflict and eventual vindication.